Welcome to episode 5 of Mind Wars Forum. Today I'm going to be welcoming Randall MacLowry, award-winning documentary filmmaker who is responsible for American Experience, The Mind Wars, and American Experience, The Feud. So I'm going to be talking with him about his experiences filming in West Virginia and how his film, The Mind Wars, fits into the overall historiography of the Mind Wars. So we hope you enjoy this episode, and please go to our website, support the museum by becoming a member or visiting our online store and check out our merchandise, buy a t-shirt, a mug, or something like that to help us to continue bringing this programming and sharing this history with you. So we hope you enjoy episode 5. Welcome, Randy. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Doing pretty well. How are you?
Doing well. And how are things up north?
Things are good. Spring has finally arrived and now suddenly feels like summer, but it's good. It's nice. We're in central Connecticut now, and it's very pleasant out here. If the lawn mowing starts up, I'll have to close the window.
Well, it's a good thing to hear anyway. It's a good sign, good sound of summer. So we're kind of switching roles here for the tables are turned a little bit because for the first time I get to interview you as opposed to you interviewing me. It's a lot less stressful for me.
Right, So I'll do my best, and I have great respect for everybody that sits in front of the camera and has to try to be articulate and intelligent and have energy and passion. And but it's been a delight always to interview you. So I'm happy to be part of this.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that you joined me. The movies that you've made, have become now a part of the historiography, not just, that they are, strong additions. A lot of people are going to get their introduction to these subject matters, albeit the Mind Wars or the Feud, through the films that you've made, as opposed to books that we might write. So let's kind of get into it. Since we're already started here, what do you think, going back a few years, what got you into filmmaking in the first place? Where did you find a passion for documentary filmmaking?
So I started studying film in college. I went to Wesleyan University, and I'm actually recently taken a position there, so I'm done a bit of a full circle there, which is exciting. I came to Wesleyan without having an idea that I would be involved with film, but I found out they had a good film program there, and I just seemed to me that was a good connection to things I had been involved with in high school, which was a lot of theater and photography. And I left Wesleyan thinking I was going to be doing narrative films. That was sort of what most of the students coming out of that program tended to do. And I went to New York and started doing, the low-level production assistant jobs, and happened to get an offer to work on a documentary series about American poets. And it was a year-long job, which at that point in a freelance career was quite exciting. And
right.
So I took that, and it kind of started taking me down the documentary path, and it led to other jobs. And so that was kind of what it was. It wasn't by any specific vision. There wasn't like a documentary film I saw growing up that inspired me to say, oh, that's what I want to do. But I found that medium really, spoke to me, and I got more involved with editing as my path into filmmaking. And it is through that I actually got connected to working on West Virginia History Film Project. I had actually left New York and gone to DC and was working for Charles Guggenheim Productions. His son, he's a very famous filmmaker. He's passed away. His son, Davis Guggenheim, did In the Convenient Truth, and continues to do documentary work out in Los Angeles. But I got an opportunity to come out to Morgantown, West Virginia, to be the editor on what became the 4-part, 6.5-hour series about the history of West Virginia. And that brought me into understanding, or beginning to understand, Appalachia. And so in terms of the passion for filmmaking, it really kind of came through opportunities that were presented to me. And for whatever reason, the path took me there, and I'm so glad that it did, because that was an amazing project and really introduced me to stories and part of the country that, while I grew up not too far from it in Washington, D.C., I didn't have a lot of, I didn't know much about the state of arts history.
Yeah, it's an underappreciated film, the West Virginia film history. It came out in the 90s. I remember when it came out. I was pretty young at the time, but I remember watching it on PBS when it came out. And at the time, it was probably the most extensive thing about the mine wars that I had seen. There'd been a little film earlier called Eve in the Heavens Week, but you couldn't find it. Nobody had internet back then because online just wasn't around. So the only thing that I had access to from a visual standpoint, other than the Matewan film, which still yet that was an independent production, there wasn't much access to that either, was this PBS film. And for many years, that was kind of the standard bearer as far as film goes for the history of this state. And it's a very West Virginia project. You have all these West Virginians involved in it. Bob Thompson did the film score, who did this wonderful, piano playing along with the whole film. What did you take from that experience, filming that?
Well, on a personal and filmmaking level, that was really my first big opportunity to be an editor on a long format film. Most of the other work I'd done had been assistant editing and doing shorter pieces for various projects. But for me, it really opened up kind of a window into this amazing piece of history, and I was really taken by sort of the richness of the place, of the people, and of the story. And I mean, I ended up staying in West Virginia, Morgantown, for a handful of years longer. Working on different projects with some of the producers out at WNPB. Some folks you may know that were there, and it was a really incredibly talented group of people there. Some of them are still there, and and we did some other different kinds of West Virginia stories. We did some narrative work. There was an adaptation of an original story Denise D'Argino wrote that we made into a short film, and also I'm blanking on the name of the other authors, a West Virginia author that we made a short film out of. So I really found it became quite attached to, I think, just sort of, there was this, Denise had a kind of a quote in the film about in West Virginia film history about sort of that sense of place and sort of that sense of connection to the land and to the geography that many West Virginians feel. And I think that I started to get a little hint of that just from my own time there, and sort of the sense of community that is part of that experience. So I think, and for us, it was a real struggle to sort of take that many couple hundred years of history and to find a way to present it on screen. And it was in conjunction with John Alexander Williams, who was also one of the writers of that film, along with Mark Samuels, who was the director. And certainly his book, The History of West Virginia, was quite important to the story we were telling and our presentation of it. Yeah,
Williams was one of the really important West Virginia historians from the 70s on up really to the present. That book, West Virginia History, is really still the book that we use in college courses, largely because there isn't any other book to use on the college level. So that book is still in print. It's still used a lot. Even though it could probably use a lot of updating, his work is still out there and Denise, of course, has probably appeared in every documentary about West Virginia from the mid-90s for the next 2 decades or so. She does such a good job of capturing a lot of things that are the essence of a lot of the history and the culture and the place, as you said. So we fast forward 20 some years and you come back to the mine wars. What brought you back to the mine wars after so many years?
Well, it was really generated through American experience. And so Mark Samuels, who was the executive producer on West Virginia Film History and had been the head of production in Morgantown at WNPB for many years, had moved on from that position after that history series was completed, and had moved up to Boston and was the senior producer, and then promoted to the executive producer of the series. And even as he was, after having finished up the West Virginia film history, he had wanted to do a story just on the mine wars and was trying to get that off the ground, before he left. And so I knew about that specific project. We were part of an NEH grant that went in way back when, and that never happened. But I think it was always something in the back of his mind that he wanted to do, that he felt like there was a bigger story to be told, or, what we told in West Virginia film history, fit into the bigger picture of the story that was being told. But there was a lot of details, a lot more information that it could sustain. So at the time, he approached myself and our company if we wanted to work on that project. They were redoing an NEH grant, and we ended up taking on doing the NEH grant, the development grant. And that was also around the time that James Green book was just about to come out. I think he was still kind of in the gallery stages when American Experience reached out to him. And so he was very involved with the project. So he was instrumental in helping us, with our NEH grant. And so we got money for that, and we were able to move forward with the project in co-production with American Experience. So it was kind of a very long tale for this story, in terms of both for Mark Samuels as executive producer and myself. And I think James Green, he had been involved with Appalachian history, for a long time as well, in terms of labor history. And and then his book, Devil in these Hills, was really quite, I felt a very compelling book, and really a strong piece of storytelling in terms of, the labor movement in the coal fields, which we couldn't really get into as detailed in the fuller West Virginia history film. And so that was really kind of the foundation initially, also for that film that came out of American Experience, I guess back in 2000, I forget, 13, 14.
I remember the first time I met Jim Green was 2011. He showed up at the last day. We had this week-long protest march to try to save Blair Mountain. And he came up to me and was talking to me in a red bandana on, and he wanted to talk to me about, he said, I'm writing a Mine Wars book. And I thought, okay, here we go, another Mine Wars book. But he did a great job in covering it from a comprehensive level. It's probably the most comprehensive study of the Mine Wars that's out there. And Randall, I should say that Corbin is probably my favorite book. Everybody has their favorite Mine Wars, but Corbin's probably my personal favorite. But Jim Green's book was so comprehensive. It started much earlier than Corbin's work, and it really covered the 20s and early 30s much better, because there's so much happened after Blair Mountain that people often forget, and the importance of the 20s and Frank Keeney's union in the 1930s. I always love the fact that in the film Mine Wars, you included a little picture at the end. You don't really have time to talk about the West Virginia Mine Workers Union, but there's a picture of two miners in the Mine Workers Union holding up a sign at the very end.
Right. Yeah.
Things up.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're marching. Yeah. That was, yeah. So, I mean, it's nice that for those that know that the significance of that as well. But yeah. And for us, I mean, it was great to be able to have yourself be a part of it, and to have somebody so directly connected to the story and to one of the main characters, and the fact that you had done so much research and work yourself on the story and invested in the story, and helping to bring Frank Keeney's life and times and to light, because I think that was something that was really I'm really proud of, sort of that part of the storytelling, and also really illuminating the relationship with Mother Jones and his in essence his politicization and radicalization in that process, and understanding sort of what was happening in America at that time, and that, you know, you think about a lot of the sort of in terms of the socialism that's going on,
Right.
and it's not oftentimes as much associated with the coal mines in Appalachia. And I think that there's that sense that this was not so separated out from what else was going on in the country, but it was in some ways even at the forefront of what was happening in terms of some of the labor movements and labor strikes, and sort of the willingness to really, you know, take hold of you know, take the sword and march with it.
Yeah, and I was really glad to be a part of it too, just because for me, of course, it's not just an academic enterprise, it's something that's personal. And it was just really a privilege to just contribute to that. The film itself is like a who's who of Appalachian historians. I pretty much know everybody that's in the film. Got Ron Lewis in there, and I'm really glad that you included him in it. I studied under him at WVU. Corbin, John Williams, and Becky Bailey, John Hennon. It's great that all of them were included in that and were able to voice their own parts and bring their own little perspectives to that, because a lot of them write these works that may be obscured or not known to the general public. Hennon wrote a great book called Americanization of West Virginia. Very few people outside of academia even know that book exists, unfortunately. But because he was in the film, he was able to take some of those things and bring it into it and put it into that format. Now, 2 hours seems like a long time to do a subject, but the Mine Wars is an immense topic. And there's, you know, many things that were in the Mine Wars that you could have elaborated on. Is there anything in there that you wish that you could have added, or if you would have had more time that you would have, you know, changed around? Or do you think it was, you know, did you say everything that you wanted to say?
I'll never say everything you want to say. I think there's always little pieces. I think in terms of trying to connect it to the bigger picture of what was happening in terms of the labor movement at that time in the country, I think it was hard. We tried to do that. I think that, and even sort of to give the bigger picture of socialism at that time and its prominence. So there was part of that. I think that there was just some wonderful personal stories that people told. I mean, we were, you know, we did try to connect with people very directly related to the story, either because they were miners or had coal mining in their family. You know, so there's and some of the people that were interviewed that have become, you know, academics also had that same background, and, you know, Becky Bailey could talk very directly about some of her own personal, you know, knowledge of her own family and the difficulties and the horrors of working in a coal mine. So there's things like that people shared with us that don't always make it in the film, that you kind of would like, and that's kind of where ideally sometimes you get, you know, the extras and so on, that you can put some of that stuff in, but it's always, you know, that's becomes a challenge at time too, in terms of, you know, getting money to do those kinds of things. But I feel like overall, I mean, I do feel like to some degree, you know, what happens after Blair Mountain gets, you know, it gets very sort of telescoped at the end of the film. And sort of some of the things, the more details of sort of the continuing efforts that Frank Keeney does make. But I feel like, you know, that I think it captured kind of an emotional quality of what that experience was, which I think was really important. I mean, I think filmmaking has I think one of the great things about it is that you can provide an emotional quality. There's an emotional aspect to it that may not always be as tangible or as tactile in a book that you're reading, whether in the combination of, you know, the way somebody's talking or speaking or telling of a story and the music and so on. And I think that combining with certain imagery and trying to incorporate, you know, I think the backdrop of the story is also the place and the beauty of that place, and, you know, the beautiful hills, but, you know, some of and played against what's actually happening underneath those hills. So, you know, I think from a filmmaking point of view, I feel like I think we did I feel very proud about how that came through.
Yeah, and I love how you mentioned the landscape. You do these intercuts of the mountains and the mist and the mountains in color, and then you go back to talking about the scenes that were happening 100 plus years ago. I really like the way that was edited together in the final product. And you're also right about um, the difficulty as a storyteller, because Blair Mountain is such an obvious climax from a storytelling perspective. You have the Battle of Blair Mountain, and it lends itself to being kind of the capstone to the story.
Mm.
And it's obviously goes so well at the end anytime you're telling the story of the mine wars, and oftentimes a lot of the stuff that comes after the treason trials and all of that, it's difficult from a storytelling perspective to kind of keep the momentum
Right.
going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's true, and I kind of the treason trials I think also got we could have spent more time with that. It was kind of interesting on the West Virginia History Project. There was a sort of a connective tissue with Charlestown, you
Mm.
know, and what happened there, and John Brown, and so on. So that there was this, you could resonate back, and you could sort of, you know, remind people of what this was. And so there was a bigger sort of, so I think we came back to that. We may have spent a little more time with that in the West Virginia History Film Project. I'm not sure. And then there's certain characters we didn't focus on nearly as much, like Bill Blizzard, you know, who
Right.
has a significant role that, you know, for us, it became primarily Keeney and Mooney, you know, and Blizzard was very active, obviously, in Blair Mountain, and was, you know, was a big part of that. So, you know, there's always tough decisions that you have to make. And, but I do think the other thing I wanted to mention that is one of the things that, you know, was a real big part of what our effort was to uncover archival material that to tell the story. I mean, there's always that issue, and we were delighted to have, you know, find things like, you know, Kenny King, who had gotten that new footage of, or I mean, he had been able to get through, I believe, an auction or something like that, some footage that was kind of in the aftermath of Blair Mountain, which was sorry about that.
That's okay.
The aftermath of that, and also finding, you know, some films, some photos of Sid Hatfield at the trial
Mm-hmm.
that had never seen before, and finding some other imagery that you know, that's, I mean, the research part is a lot of fun, and really trying to locate new things and stuff that hasn't been seen before. So that was a big part of our journey too.
Our museum would not exist without Kenny King. He, if Kenny King can't find it, it almost can't be found. He's always, he'll give me random phone calls or emails saying that he found some postcard from 1921 or a picture. He's found pictures of my great grandfather that I didn't know existed
Oh wow!
and sent to me. So yeah, he's like this ultimate mine wars scavenger. He's somehow able to find all these different things, and everybody that studies the mine wars and has an appreciation for the history kind of owes a debt to him, and all the collecting and searching and investigative work that he's done just in getting objects and pictures. Now, with this film, it's more people will probably watch American Experience Mine Wars even now and going on in the years than will read Mine Wars books. That's just, you know, films reach more people than books do. And for example, I've got two nephews and two nieces. Their first real experience of learning about the Mine Wars was watching your film, and they had to watch it in class.
That's good.
In their 8th grade West Virginia studies courses that everybody has to take. Oftentimes in West Virginia, you have to take in the 8th grade a West Virginia studies course. Usually the teachers are not specialists in West Virginia history. It's the social studies teacher or somebody that they just kind of throw it on to and say, you have to teach this class. And for example, my 8th grade West Virginia history teacher was also the Spanish teacher. and she didn't know anything about West Virginia history. So that happens sometimes. And oftentimes, as a substitute, what they do is they put in a film. If there's a documentary film that they can cover a subject with. So a lot of students are going to be introduced to this subject in the classroom with that film. For them, what do you want them to take away from your film? If you were talking to an 8th grader or a room full of 8th grade students, what would you want them to be able to take from it?
I think the main thing that I want people to take away from this is the story of the miners and the stories of their resilience and their willingness to stand up and fight for their rights. I mean, I think it really is a story of democracy. It's a story of understanding and trying to shape the experience of your own environment in a way that is expressive of the freedoms that are supposed to exist for you as a human being. And so I think it's really that understanding. I think that it's universal and is, doesn't diminish in time. The idea that we're living in a place that is supposed to be, the birth of democracy and the cradle of democracy. And you had a situation where people were living in basically at times tyrannical and undemocratic environment. And, what does it take, and what are the, at what point do people, basically rise up and stand up and decide that, they are trying to take their lives into their own hands and being the architects of that. So I think I hope it's an empowering film in that way, and an inspiring film to think about, what do you value? And at what point do you feel like you need to fight for these things that are, or one of the things in quotes on either you're gonna, it might have been your quote, either you're gonna, kind of sort of take it, or you're gonna stand up and fight.
Right.
So I think that's sort of, for us, the core is sort of like, is that dignity that they had in their work, but also knowledge that they needed to be treated in a dignified way as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And you just touched on some of the same themes that David Corbin talked about when I was in our first episode of this series, where he was talking about, these, why remember Matewan, why look back 100 years and things like that. And you just mentioned some of the same thematic concepts that you brought about. So yeah, that's great. Now, what kind of reaction did you get from it over the years? Have you gotten any reactions from, have any West Virginians contacted you, emailed you, or people from outside the state that may be unfamiliar? Is there anything that stood out whenever the film came out? And I know it's been 4 years, but is there anything that
I mean, nothing specific either. Nothing negative that really sort of that I recall, or I mean, just general sense of people being appreciative of getting a chance to be exposed to the story and learning the story. And I'm trying to think. I don't remember. Nothing specifically jumps out at me as being that just caught me and really was as kind of crystallized the experience for me in terms of people's response to it.
No threatening calls from the West Virginia Coal Association. Nothing.
Not that I know of, but they might be tapping this call still. I don't know.
They may. I know a little about that. Yes. So, yeah, the response here was overwhelmingly positive, and I've only heard positive things from the people that have seen it, and I'm really just really thrilled to have been a part of something that I think is going to be used in the classroom for many years. And you followed that up. Well, this wasn't the next film that you did, but your next West Virginia film was The Feud. And the Mine Wars and The Feud are probably the two biggest events from the industrial period that my region is known for. And The Feud probably played an even bigger role in establishing the national perception of the region. And how do you think these two overlap, or do you see an overlap or something similar between the two? How are these two related in your mind?
So, and this is one thing that we weren't able to in our hour-long film on The Feud, try to make some of those connections. But I think the Feud is laying out the groundwork, and it's in terms of what is happening in the area that really allows sort of the institutional and systemic architecture that leads to the mine wars, in terms of sort of the outside capitalists, the taking of land for resources, and the basically the buying up of mineral rights, and really dispossessing people of the land. So I think that's a huge part of what sort of plays into the mine wars, and and certainly the feud plays a large role in terms of sort of the perception of America, of this area. The mine wars, I think, changes to a degree the makeup of the people that are in the characters that are in the story. It becomes a much more diverse story with the mine wars, with all the different ethnic and racial groups that come into West Virginia. But in terms of I think the idea of placing also sort of establishing also there's a quality of that area being seen as innately violent, which I think gets manipulated during the Cold Wars, as if assigning that to the reason why all this violence is happening in West Virginia, because West Virginia is a violent place. There were plenty of other violent labor strikes going on, in the country as well. But I think it became a tool, became a way to sort of marginalize that area as part of that as well.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I think the film does really well. You look at the bigger industrial picture. And it was, I remember being interviewed for the Mine Wars was a piece of cake for me, because I can talk about that for hours without any kind of prep. I remember the night before you interviewed me for the Feud, I was basically up all night studying, like I was preparing for comps. So I had to really prep a lot more for that one. But I loved the fact that you were looking at the larger picture of industrial transition, and you minimalized things like the hog trial, or the romance between Roseanne and Johns, and all of these little details that really aren't that important to the bigger picture. Now, I would have loved to have seen a 2-hour Feud film as opposed to the 1 hour. But I bring it up because I teach West Virginia history, of course, if not every semester, at least once a year, in either the college that I'm at, or sometimes even adjuncting. I teach it. I always either spend a lot of time focusing on the Mine Wars and the Feud, because that's such a huge part of our history here. And this past time, I showed your film on the Feud, but before I got to it, I wanted to know, and this was in Logan, where I taught it, and I wanted to know what my students knew about it. It's a funny thing about Southern West Virginia. First of all, everybody thinks they're related to Devil Anse Hatfield. Everybody claims to be related to Devil Anse Hatfield, and everybody claims to be part Cherokee. I don't know why Cherokee, but for whatever reason, everybody thinks they're part Cherokee, and everybody thinks they're the third grand nephew or cousin or whatever to Devil Anse. But I asked them about the Feud, what they thought started the Feud, and almost every single student thought it was over a pig. And this is in Logan County, where Devil Anse Hatfield died, where he spent the last years of his life. The people who live there still have that misconception about it. And it's so important to understand the broader forces of industrial transition. And I think that your film did that well.
Well, it's good to hear. I mean, that was certainly the framing device that we were working with. And it's a tough story to tell, because there are so many things that are sort of sensationalized about the story itself, and it sort of gets I think it almost become a myth, as opposed to something, not to say there's not facts connected to it, but it's hard to sort of really know what the truth is on certain elements of things. And there's this, I mean, you can get lost in a lot of the, you get stuck in the weeds, as they say, in terms of trying to figure that out and so on. And for us, it was the bigger picture of really trying to, get a sense of what this place was like, and what the communities were like prior to industrialization, and then how that just really upended a way of life, and also you really fostered an environment and a climate that put these people in situations where it's not to, it was all it's a difficult thing. Trying to excuse violence, which is not what we were trying to do, but say that that there was pressures that were on these individuals, and there was also things that were being presented in a very sensationalized way about what was actually happening and who they were, that really sort of are part of the story that it's important. And I think that there's in terms of works that are really important for that film, Altina Waller's film on the Feud was obviously her was kind of did groundbreaking work and looking at that, and then also in kind of a wider Appalachian concept, Ramp Hollow by Stephen Stoll, in terms of looking at sort of what that impact is in terms of that transition from the more communal self-sustaining livelihood and culture that was part of that area at the time, which was changing in its own right, just because of the limited amount of arable space, land, and so on. The geography was very difficult, and you could only carve up so many acres to so many offspring and make it still continue to be viable. But the speed and the rapidity of the industrialization that happened there, the railroads coming in, was just such a transformative moment to that area.
Yeah, and I hope that one day there will be a Feud museum near the Mine Wars Museum. It's because that history is right there, maybe 100 yards or so from where the Battle of Matewan took place, is where Devilance and then the Hatfields executed the McCoy boys. It's right there on property that was once Devilance Hatfields. It's just all that history right there where our museum is. So it's really great that you got to be a part of both of those big seminal historical sagas in our history. So what are you working on now?
I'm thrilled. I'm just honored that I'm able to have been a part of trying to tell those stories, and it's really to hear that these films are being well received, had been well received in West Virginia, and for the Feud also hopefully in Eastern Kentucky, that it's in Kentucky, that it was. That's important to hear, because we do try to be as accurate and fair in presenting the stories and bringing these things to light, and to know that it's impactful, and to know that they're in classrooms, that's a very satisfying thing to know.
Yeah, well, good, and it should be in classrooms, and I'm glad that it is. So what are you working on now? What's next?
So we're in the midst of our editing phase for a new project for American Experience. Very different from either of those two films, but it's about L. Frank Baum and the writing of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and the legacy of that seminal piece of American popular culture. So,
and are you dealing with it as a piece of populism?
No, we're not. We're not going down the Littlefield parable of populism storytelling. It's interesting in terms of what sort of things have gotten laid onto that story, and that really did take it took hold in academia. But I think you can make those comparisons, but I think if you determine about the intentions of the author, we don't see it there in terms of him having that artistic or even political side to what he was doing with the story. So, but no, we're looking at it, the Wizard of Oz came out in 1900, so his lifespans is sort of very another transformative time, which is similar obviously with these other films with the industrialization, and he had he was in very interesting places in his life at different times, and out in the Dakotas in the late 1880s, right at the time of Wounded Knee, and then he was in Chicago during the World's Fair, and we're kind of looking at the things that what intersected his life and was in the country, and how some of those things also are reflected in the work that he created. So I think it's an interesting story, and certainly everybody knows about the film, and I don't know how many people necessarily as much today know about the book, that it was the original book
Right.
and the series that came out of it. So yeah, that'll be coming out in February of next year.
February of next year. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it. Well, great. Well, great. I'm looking forward to it. I've always enjoyed your films. You did a good one on the swamps in
Yeah.
Florida.
Everglades. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you.
That was a good one too, and a lot of other great work. But Randy, I'm thrilled that you were able to sit down and talk with me for a little bit, and I know our membership will really appreciate it. We did a screening of Mind Wars a couple of years ago and had a great crowd that came out
Good.
for that screening. So thanks again for joining, and greatly appreciate it, and for what you've contributed to the Mind Wars history and to that body of work that's out there. To wrap up, though, for our viewers, we hope that you will become a museum member or visit our online store and get some merchandise and help support the museum while we're dealing with this pandemic. And Randy, once again, thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. And I look forward to coming down and seeing the museum when it opens up in its new space.
I hope to see you soon.
All right.